Does it feel like to you that it seems that every other application wants a copy of your face and ID documents?
Yes!
I don't know about you personally, but for me, it's starting to get annoying. But how did we get here? Why do we have so much papers and why does everyone want to see them? Welcome to today's episode of The Context, and we're going to talk about Papers, Please. ID cards and passports have become such a staple part of our lives that it's easy to forget that they're in fact man-made inventions. That means they have a history. In fact, the first reference to something like a passport document originates from 1414. Apparently, King Henry V would give passports to his subjects so when they were in foreign lands they could prove who they were and where they came from. But the modern IT system was set in motion by Napoleon, who after the revolutions of 1789 and 1799 started issuing ID documents to the French workers in order to streamline the work of the centralized government. For a bureaucracy to work, the government needs to know who you are, and for that we need ID papers. By the second half of the 19th century, Europe was covered in railways. Commerce and capitalism had exploded, and so did international travel. In these days, it was largely passport-free. All was well for approximately 30 years before the First World War. Times were different back then. At the end of the First World War, at the Treaty of Versailles in 1990, the powers that came together wanted to return to the old system, paperless travel. However, one thing went wrong. The Spanish flu pandemic had broken out, putting a dent in that plan. After the war, the concept of the passport mutated. Now it became an object used to regulate the movement of people, owing to concerns of national security and health. You see, the pandemic had exposed that modern nation-states were so interconnected that a pathogen could travel and wreak havoc continent-wide very fast. Not everyone was happy about such developments. Even Charlie Chaplin had a bit where he was criticizing the concept.
Only with the passport.
Will you allow me to say something?
Only with the passport.
If you know history, then you know that the story doesn't go as rosy from here on. The modern ID document system originates in World War II. The UK was the first to pass the National Registry Act, which mandated that all citizens have an ID card in 1938. This was meant to be a temporary wartime measure. The Germans also introduced an ID system in 1940, but this one also included the person's religion. After the war, these ID systems largely remained intact, so they made it their way into our everyday lives. The question remains though, now we understand where the physical ID documents come from, but why does every app and website want to see it? That brings us to another dark part of history, the Taliban. You see, the terror attack on the World Trade Center in 9/11 was organized and coordinated using the US financial system. Back in those days, it was very easy for foreign nationals to open bank accounts and move money around internationally. Following the crackdown on terrorism, the US introduced something called the Patriot Act. And when they drafted the Patriot Act, US banks were also involved in the process to make sure that something like this could never happen again. This is where Know Your Customer and anti-money laundering regulations come from. It basically means that online businesses are required by law to make sure they know who they're dealing with. And the best that they had was either the existing ID documents, and with the advent of smartphones, selfies. As you can guess, this system is a downright hot mess. There's so many countries with so many different national registries, so many different ID formats, that the whole thing is extreme. A f***ing train? Are you f***ing kidding me? But the train track is like 5 miles. As you can imagine, this system is a downright hot mess. There's so many different national systems, different registries, different formats of passports and ID cards, that the whole system is very expensive to maintain. This is why for the past few years there's been a lot of promise in digitalizing the whole thing, making our identities trackable digitally or using digital solutions to make different systems interoperable. Implementation of this was going rather slowly, and then COVID hit. So the emergency situation due to the pandemic has basically accelerated the development of a more digitalized and unified ID system. Sounds good, right? Nothing can go wrong with that.
Psych!
What seems to be happening here is that we have a problem that's rooted in the real world of human flesh, and now we have a digital hammer, and the problem is looking like a digital nail. On paper, that sounds actually pretty good. You don't have to trust all these different companies and entities with data. You just have a unified repository which you can use to prove that you are who you say you are. Everybody saves costs, no more annoying selfies, no more friction. What could go wrong, right? And if you think about ID cards and passports, they were notoriously easy to fake or to forge. All you needed were committed criminals who had intent to do so, and specialized craftsmen who knew how to do it. Digital technologies only made this easier, and putting the whole thing in the cloud will not make the problem go away.
I don't want peace. I want problems, always!
Sci-fi movies promised us high-tech stuff, like retina scans and biometric authentication, but during the last 2 years, all we got were QR codes. All criminals have to do is figure out how the system works and where the single point of failure is. Consider the case of QR codes. You can beat those security systems as long as you have a screenshot of someone else's code and you can pass as them.
That's some bullshit.
I'm thinking on how to wrap this up. Of course, nothing is yet settled in stone. We live in uncertain times, both economically, geopolitically, and there's talk about the age of pandemics coming, which means it's up in the air whether the new passport system is here to stay or not. Similar to how 100 years ago, it took a good couple of years until things settled, and a lot of battle between the courts and common people. We don't know how the story ends just yet. But we do know that the promise of complete and full security is almost always too optimistic. And criminals everywhere are waiting for the system to arrive so they can go look for loopholes to exploit. Digital ID systems will have to pass through the test of time. Thank you for watching The Context. I was your host, Gergely Varga. I hope you enjoyed the show and that I will see you soon.